So this is something a little bit out of left field for me, to be honest, but after a bit of a busy period in university as it stood, I now have a little bit of free time and a bit of a palate cleanser was in order, and also a little bit of catharsis maybe offered for myself here, as I don't only play Total War games, as my channel may actually suggest, because this is a developer, which will be one of the main subjects of this coming video, that I've been along for the ride with for quite a while at this point. And I am of course talking about Bioware and their upcoming game, which is going to be Anthem, although while this video is going to be talking about what I think of Anthem and how I think it's going to turn out personally, the main reason that I want to do this, the main desire for wanting to do this, is because of Bioware themselves and not necessarily the game that they are making, and I'll be going over the reasons for that as the video goes along, of course. I hope that this won't turn into too much of a ramble, but then again, I've only done one similar video like this in the past, so I am going to be a little bit rusty in this format. Usually I'm used to making commentaries and predictions based on things which are happening live right in front of me rather than based on a series of notes that I have made, but yes. Anthem. What do I think it will be, and do I think it will be good? Bioware have been around for quite some time now in some form or another. Ever since the mid-90s they've been churning out games that have been given plenty of public attention and critical acclaim. From Baldur's Gate to KOTOR to Mass Effect, they are one of the most recognisable names in the RPG space. And while my personal experience with them doesn't actually extend right the way back to their beginnings, because I wasn't actually alive when Bioware were formed, but it does start relatively early on with the original Xbox and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 1. And this was one of two games alongside The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind that actually introduced me to RPG games in general. And of course, as a very young child who was very much into Star Wars, I fell in love with that game, and it still maintains a position as one of my favourite games of all time. And throughout all of that decade in particular, they really built a reputation for their name denoting quality, in particular with games like Mass Effect 1 and 2. The Mass Effect trilogy in general can be seen as a bit of a flashpoint for gaming as a whole, even with how sort of impactful it really was. And of course the first Dragon Age, which really did give a feeling of them combining everything that they had learnt throughout their history and sort of making it into this one game which had so much to offer. Dragon Age Origins, in terms of, even for its time, the gameplay and the visuals were perhaps a little bit dated, but everything else about the game, the things which in an RPG really do matter, sort of like the story and the characterizations, were absolutely spot on, and of course there was a lot that you could do to define yourself in that game as well. However, while the so-called noughties were a bit of a golden generation for Bioware overall, and by the end of them, back in 2010, it would seem that they could do no wrong, the current decade has seen their reputation sour quite a lot with the horrifying disaster that was Dragon Age 2, which was one of the most startling drops in quality for a sequel that I can possibly reference. The Star Wars MMO, The Old Republic, which, even though I found some personal enjoyment in there, was unceremoniously dubbed Tortanic for costing so much to develop and ultimately failing to unseat World of Warcraft as the king of MMOs. The Mass Effect 3 ending controversy, which quite frankly could be the subject of so many videos all on its own, and of course it was back in the day. And then the case of Mass Effect Andromeda, where an under-equipped and really underqualified dev team were clearly never going to be able to deliver a product that lived up to the name that was on the box. Dragon Age Inquisition is perhaps the one bright spot within the current decade that Bioware can point to, but even the 2014 Game of the Year, in my eyes, was simply good as opposed to being the great that they developed back in what I certainly perceived as their golden age. So that brings us to now, and the topic of this video, Anthem. The one thing that has really stood out for me, actually, in the lead up to this game is the tension that seems to be around it. It feels like there's a lot at stake for everyone involved with the development of this game, and the palpable feeling of EA brandishing their well-worn executioner's axe behind the studio as it works. This alone would be enough to make any watching fans nervous, but adding to that is the nature of this new game, an almost by-the-book looter-shooter gamer's service, heavily online and co-op focused, not exactly what Bioware is known for. In the past, the narratives and the characters are what have sort of set their games apart from the competition, with the gameplay as a general rule being okay, but other options on the market would generally offer more in this regard. For example, comparing Mass Effect as a purely third-person shooter to titles like the Gears of War series would have the Bioware title facing an uphill battle, because obviously they divided their attentions between obviously the story, the characters and the gameplay, whereas something like Gears of War is almost entirely focused on the gameplay. For Anthem, as much as they may say otherwise, the stripping of several identifying features of their games, most notably the party of course, the narrative and story are heavily secondary to the gameplay in this sense, and I'm sure that many of them will say sort of the party is now no longer NPCs, it's going to be your friends, but we saw how well making every human character a real person worked for Fallout 76, but more on that later. With a game of this type, the narrative and story are going to be heavily secondary to the gameplay, and you don't have to look too far for them admitting as much, so nothing to hide behind this time from a gameplay point of view, so it's going to be on full focus here. The irony of all this is that the studio often mocked for Andromeda did develop Mass Effect 3's multiplayer and Andromeda, and the gameplay for Andromeda is often thought of as being the best part of it. But Montreal are not going to be the ones developing this, which, to be fair, some people will probably be quite happy with, but it is Edmonton, the main Bioware studio. Even so, everything about this game from a developer perspective does seem to be unproven, and considering the stakes which seem to be on this game, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence for its overall quality when it does eventually come out. And it's not just the developer that would seem to have a lot riding on this game, but the one pulling the strings, the publisher, as well. I don't think there's really much I can add to the discussion about EA that hasn't already been said, to be honest with you, and you would certainly struggle to find anyone with many kind words to say about them, and it would be very hard to argue that they haven't earned their infamous reputation. And it's also quite the coincidence that EA's acquisition of Bioware back at the tail end of the previous decade coincided with a rather sharp drop in quality and an increase in some of the darker arts with regards to the business practices implemented in gaming. Even in Dragon Age Origins, they started to sort of exert their influence a little bit. As good as Dragon Age Origins was, I'm sure that anyone who played that game will remember that there was a fellow who hung around in your party camp and would not go away until you bought the Soldier's Peak DLC. And while that wasn't so egregious compared to what was to come, it was still a bit of a taster. And obviously as well, Mass Effect 2, which did away with some of the more unique aspects with how the gameplay worked in Mass Effect 1. Overall, the gameplay in Mass Effect 2 was tighter and better. But things like standard ammunition being introduced was one thing which you could say made the game a little bit more accessible. You know, maybe that wasn't EA, but maybe it was. And in particular, though, something like the Cerberus network has obviously got EA written all over it. The rushed schedule, however, of Dragon Age 2 and Mass Effect 3 would both follow, and these were much graver indicators of what would be to come. I would also find it very hard to believe that Anthem is not a creation that was mandated by EA rather than a creative proposal from Bioware themselves that they rubber-stamped. At the very least, the genre is something which EA surely insisted upon. While the world and initial concept may very well have been the result of creative meetings at Bioware when EA saw the potential to shift that into a live service game, I think you can see where my line of thought here is going. And it certainly makes sense. This genre is such a good fit for how EA seem to go about their business that I'm honestly surprised it's taken them until now to have a product ready to be put out. A game with a long life cycle that you can drip feed content into and charge saps every step of the way is far too tempting for an entity like EA to resist. However, how far they were going to push the monetization also in lies a rather big issue that Anthem may have, which obviously the public will not be made privy to this information, but it's a fairly safe bet considering when Anthem was released and the context of what happened later on in the same year. You can sort of draw a few conclusions about what Anthem was probably going to be. Anthem was revealed at E3 2017, and by then you have to imagine that the in-game business model was also probably largely finalised at that point. Then Battlefront 2 happened, and EA's intended plans for the future was laid bare, and it went down extremely poorly. It's very hard to imagine that Anthem wouldn't have had very similar systems in place, and now we know it probably won't. EA might get far too big for their boots again and try and implement something very invasive once more. So it's probably just going to be more basic microtransactions that Anthem will have. They've already confirmed, of course, that it's going to be cosmetics without any sort of chance-based mechanics. But EA are certainly the sort of company that internally you know they want to make everything like FIFA. They've been very honest about this, both in the past and more recently as well. And this game will be deprived of that because the public response to it would be absolutely hideous once again. However, without these chance mechanics, the revenue ceiling for this game will be lower, and you have to imagine that EA's hopes for this game pre-Battlefront 2 controversy, even if publisher expectations are often extremely silly anyway, will be impossible to meet now with the current level of microtransactions that they can get away with, and you have to wonder if this game has any chance of being considered a success by EA, even if it performs to its absolute peak, based on the initial expectations they will have had for it. Regardless, EA's influence is certainly a part of Anthem, and that alone may be enough to both affect the quality and, honestly, with how bad their PR has been lately, to put people off as well. The genre has already been briefly mentioned with how it isn't exactly what Bioware are most well known for, and while it is a multiplayer third-person shooter, these live service looter-shooter pseudo-MMOs are practically their own breed at this point, with examples including both of the Destiny games, Division 1 and soon-to-be Division 2. Fallout 76 is a somewhat infamous example of this as well, with Bethesda's very desperate attempt to get on the live service bandwagon, but even more positively thought of examples exist as well, such as Warframe. But again, I do feel as though the most important thing really to stress about the genre is that this is not a role-playing game. This is not an RPG that Bioware are making, which is why I always feel as though Bioware will not be able to sort of receive the thunderous applause which I believe EA hope they will for this game. It could turn out to be absolutely fantastic, and just the fact that the genre is not something that Bioware fans are usually used to is the sort of thing which will affect the game ultimately. And I am one of these people, because if this was a Bioware RPG, in spite of the fact that I have certainly had my criticisms of the company, especially recently with regards to their quality, their overall attitudes as well, if it were an RPG I would be buying it, without question, whereas as it stands that is much more in question because of the type of game that it is. All of these games previously have all come out with their own problems, whether that is a lack of content or whether that is being utterly broken. It seems to vary from game to game how severe the issues actually are, and I am certain, in fact I know, based on the fact that I am actually recording the audio for this just after the demo has gone live, that there will be issues with Anthem. How serious they actually are on release, however, remains to be seen. Now this may all seem like a bit of a downer on the area overall, but I do feel as though it is a genre that does have potential, but I don't really feel as though anyone has really taken it to its fullest yet, and I feel as though with the focus on it being around its monetization potential rather than sort of making a game with really good mechanics and gameplay, I feel as though that is going to be something which will continue to be a bit of an issue. Playing with friends, for example, is something which I feel as though will get a few audience groans and eye rolls whenever a new game comes out and sort of immediately touts this, like, yes, you can play with your friends and this should be the reason why you buy this game. And yes, good multiplayer games are actually pretty hard to come by, because there are a lot of multiplayer games which are trash, and getting a really good one is hard. I also feel as though, especially the whole sort of multiplayer angle, especially when it comes from EA, who declared basically the demise of single player games, it will gain a little bit of extra vitriol from the community that they are advertising to. But a good multiplayer experience in this vein would create a very, very good game, I'm sure, and good multiplayer is something which games have thrived off for many years, and as I said, a good multiplayer experience, co-op experience, can be very hard to come by now with so much garbage being shoveled out by so many people. Live services also have the promise of a game that evolves over time, and plenty of opportunity to get invested in the world that you are exploring and what it has to offer. Now obviously this is with a view business-wise to just monetize every step of the way, which I do feel as though is a bit of a detriment to the area overall. However, the fact that you can get so invested in a single game is something which you don't really see an awful lot of. And in particular, I feel as though this is actually an area where you can compare to something like Mass Effect, where they were able to sort of foster this genuine care that the players had for the game that they were playing, purely because they were able to sort of have it across these three games that were linked to one another. This is technically something that you could port across into one of these live service games. However, the main focus with live services is, and probably always will be at this point, the money-making potential of it, which will usually mean sort of gameplay additions and more basic things rather than sort of a story-heavy experience that I feel as though a live service could actually be quite good for if it were executed right. But again, the fact that it is EA makes me very leery of the fact that this will be such an experience. Many of these live service games also do prioritise the gameplay, and obviously with Anthem you have the concept of slapping on your big suit of power armour and facing a series of monsters that are several times your greater in size. Sounds pretty fun, just from a purely visceral perspective. However, much more is needed in order to make sure the game isn't shallow. My previous point about how the game can evolve over time and you can really get people to care about it won't matter too much if you cannot get people invested from the start. And ultimately, while all of these games do start relatively simply, you know, The Division, you know, Destiny are examples of this as well, where they started off pretty slowly and were able to recover. However, now that the market is fuller, I feel as though the leeway that Anthem will be given will be much less. And also, again, with the recovery, potential recovery anyway, that Bungie may give to Destiny 2, the fact that Division 2 is going to release right around the corner means that Anthem is certainly not going to have the market all to itself, so it will need to hit the ground running with a less empty feeling than some of its peers had on release. And that really would be my first downside to the genre overall, the fact that it is already rather oversaturated. Obviously Division 2 is going to release very soon after Anthem, which, to be honest, Division 2 is probably the game that will suffer more from having released after Anthem, unless Anthem turns out to be an unmitigated disaster like Fallout 76 was, in which case Division 2 can capitalise on players wanting to scratch that itch by moving over there. But also presumably Destiny 3 will be a game that will release further down the road, when and that will be the first Destiny title that Bungie will release away from Activision. Now Destiny is a whole nother topic, to be honest, and I do feel as though personally that Activision cannot be blamed for all of Destiny's woes. I do feel as though Bungie were partly to blame there as well. Obviously some of the more business aspects were certainly Activision, but I do feel as though the actual game itself was rather lacking in several areas, and obviously Bungie are the ones responsible for that. But it does seem as though everyone wants a piece of the live service pie, but there is only so much pie to go around these days, and Anthem doesn't have the advantage of an already established audience like The Division and Destiny do have. Even if those games maybe didn't set the world alight, they did still acquire an audience, and you know, those people will still be loyal to those games over a relative newcomer. And I feel as though even then, having an established audience for you as a company is going to be no shield in this area, as Fallout 76 so comprehensively proves. Bethesda were given a free pass for so many years with so many of the flaws in their games, and obviously I really liked Bethesda games. However, Fallout 76 was them getting a little bit too far ahead of themselves, overextending a little bit, and trying to rely on their goodwill a little bit too much. And if Bioware does that, Bioware have already done a little bit more damage than Bethesda did to their reputation pre-Fallout 76, I feel. So but Bioware doesn't even have that much of a safety net to go into with regards to this game, so they do need to be very careful from that perspective. The best way to counteract, though, will be to simply make sure that the game works on launch, which obviously is easier said than done, but based on the amount of development hours and the amount of developers that the game has actually had, I would hazard to guess that Anthem will not be quite on the same level as Fallout 76 with regards to that. However, these games do tend to come out a bit bare bones, as I mentioned before, and many of them have underwhelmed on release, giving Destiny and Division both credit, they did at least improve on this with expansions, in particular, with particular examples. The Division with its survival mode very much changed things up, and I actually did play a little bit of that, and it was very fun. And Destiny, obviously, with its numerous expansions, eventually got to the point, Destiny 1 at the very least, where it was better. Destiny 2 is kind of in the process of doing that as well, but it does seem to be a bit of a case of knocking everything that you built down and then building back up and going through the same struggles with these games a little bit. So we'll see if Anthem falls into the same pitfalls, because Anthem can scarce afford a reception as frosty as the likes of Destiny 2, and certainly not the lead balloon that was Fallout 76, as mentioned previously. The potential revenue from this sort of game is clearly extremely large. That's why so many publishers and developers want to get in on the action, but therefore so are the expectations that the money men tend to put on it. You can obviously look at Activision for Destiny 2 here with their ludicrous expectations for what that game would actually sell, and obviously it ended up coming a little bit short of that, and so then they decided that they were originally going to slap a little bit more in terms of the micro content that was in the game. And you can bet that even with their nose bloodied from Battlefront 2, EA will expect big initial numbers and strong, consistent revenue from Anthem, which I'm not sure if the consistent revenue will be as much as they hoped, for reasons that I've already mentioned, but they will expect a lot of sales on release, and I feel as though the Bioware name in general is the reason why Bioware were given this game and they were mandated to create it in the first place. I'm not sure whether the numbers will be as big as EA want, however, and if recent publisher expectations are to go by, Bioware are being set up for failure here, to be honest, because I don't feel as though their expectations will be met. Even if EA were allowed to put in Battlefront 2 style microtransactions, I don't believe the money stream would be enough for them, so I feel as though Bioware, part of the tension could be because Bioware already know that they are going to be sort of given a stern talking to by upper management for not meeting overinflated expectations, which this genre seems to be rife with. But I think it's about time that I started talking about the game itself rather than just the orbiting factors surrounding it, through mostly the promotional materials and the gameplay reveals, and also the very recent VIP demo that was released. As with the game that has not yet released, obviously promotional material is designed to make the game look good, and while there may be PR blunders, for the most part they aren't going to show off parts of the game that look either unfinished or unsatisfactory for advertising standards, so do have to bear that in mind as I go through what the game has actually revealed thus far, because obviously it is advertising, it is designed to look good. And I will be talking about how it looks on its own merit and how it seems to be stacking up to some of the competition previously mentioned, in particular some of the games which have been noted to be very similar looking to Anthem. So Destiny and Warframe in particular have got a lot of similarities to it, but also other live service games like the Division series, and obviously while Fallout 76 may have been a disaster, it is still a warning for Bioware to look to. To start with, this is a new IP, and while it might not be as story or character focused as what Bioware have done in the past, you do need to put effort into building a good world so that it stands out from the rest of the competition around it. Because if you don't, people simply won't get invested, and you need people to get invested in a game like this, because otherwise the revenue stream that EA so desires will not manifest itself and the game will ultimately be a failure. And this is on Bioware, because this is a creative part that they will have had full control over, so they needed to make it as interesting as possible. Now obviously details on the world are relatively high level for the time being. Obviously they want to save quite a lot of the deeper secrets for the game itself, I would imagine, but on the official website there is a sort of series of quotes which sort of describe the backstory of the world of Anthem. In the beginning, the gods harnessed the Anthem, a source of pure creation. Wondrous lands erupted into existence. Colossal beasts, creatures, and monsters emerged. But before their work was complete, the gods vanished, leaving behind an unfinished world strewn with the instruments of their creation. The power of the Anthem would not be contained, unleashing world-altering cataclysms, transforming and corrupting those that tried to wield its power. Humanity sought a way to survive, so our ancestors created the Javelin exosuits, handcrafted armour that gave us superhuman abilities. Our world remains an eternal struggle between the power of the Anthem and the instruments of the gods who formed it. Today, the fate of humanity rests in the hand of a small band of javelin pilots known as the Freelancers. So obviously there's only so much that you can glean from those few quotes describing the backstory of the world, but overall it is a setting which should have potential. I mean, it is a very basic outline, of course, but, you know, godlike entities leaving behind the tools with which they use to forge creation, which are presumably at least still partially working, is an interesting gambit that could be used throughout the story of the game. The Anthem itself being able to warp the world and anyone who tries to interact with it is also another interesting point, because it means that we'll be able to see presumably some quite unnatural things and mutated things throughout the game. And an incomplete hostile world that only a handful of people can navigate reliably, so obviously this is going to include the players in their javelin suits, means it should have quite a very wild feeling to the game, and obviously the sense of exploration is something that a lot of bigger games certainly have been trying to push quite hard, and I would assume that Anthem is going to be no different, particularly with the methods of travel, which we'll get onto in a moment. But yeah, it would appear that that is going to be a rather big thing, so obviously a very wild setting, very hostile setting as well that you're going to have to traverse. The fact that the world is incomplete and being actively warped is probably what intrigues me the most about this, actually. You know, the potential of certain things like wandering into an area that gives off a blank part of the canvas feeling, and fighting creatures that look completely unnatural and sort of unbelievable in a way because they've been warped by the Anthem, is an opportunity for a lot of creativity, I feel. To give an example of this, actually, though, again completely different, Oblivion. There was a painted world quest where as soon as you got to the end of what was essentially just a small dungeon with a few, you know, a very different sort of palette that they use and a few painted trolls that you fought, but at the end of the dungeon there was a sort of blank canvas at the end, which sort of led to the idea that the painting was unfinished. And I feel as though there is the opportunity to do something similar with Anthem in a few more creative ways as well. If the world wasn't finished by the gods, I know that the Anthem and the tools are still active, as was said in the backstory, but I do feel as though if they aren't manned and if the Anthem is untamed, that should give rise to some pretty interesting ideas if they choose to go that route. But whether any of that will be realised or not, or if the whole game will just be the jungles that we've seen whilst fighting sci-fi versions of D&D monsters, remain to be seen. I feel as though that would be a real shame, because from that point of view in particular, that would add a lot visually and to the gameplay, I feel, if what I said did come to pass. And it is an opportunity for the developers to ultimately be creative, even if the genre was mandated by EA. There is still a bit of wiggle room here for Bioware, and if it ends up being generic, it will be on them, unfortunately. There are also a few questions that I would have about the world, like, did the gods create humans? And if they did, how did we go from what would presumably be early man to having access to the power armor and postmodern weapons without using the corrupting ability of the Anthem or the tools? Now, I would imagine that this will be explained in the game as people finding a way to use some of the gods' still active tools. But I do hope that, well, I would hope certainly that they give more than just a passing explanation. Destiny, I think, was plagued with this, where they didn't really explain much of anything and you had to look at expanded material in order to get the full view. That is a real mistake, because you really need to have at least the ability to understand everything that's going on from a very basic standpoint from the game, and I feel as though even more than that is needed to really set yourself apart. It is an area that Anthem can improve on Destiny. If the gods did create humans, why are we the exception and most other creatures seem to be monstrous? Now, it could be that humanity was the first sort of intelligent race that was created, and after that the gods simply vanished, or the gods may never have existed at all and it was just all a myth. Again, this is a question that I feel as though probably won't be answered immediately when the game is out, because as a live service game they obviously want the content to last for quite a while, so they do need those mysteries to sustain player interest in what the narrative will be, however much time that will actually take up in the game itself. But this is another question that I feel as though really does need a little bit more put into it, other than just, you know, we exist because humans need to exist to have the game work and for people to play in it. That would be a very lazy explanation indeed, and wouldn't really wash with most players, I feel. If we have the ability to create these javelins, these massive suits of power armor, why not give them to everyone and train them in their use? Are there not enough resources or expertise, which would seem to be the most obvious answer? Did we lose the ability to create more as well? Now, I feel as though just having, obviously, you know, The idea that only a handful of people, a handful of real players going out into the world sort of battling against the odds, hideously outnumbered, is obviously what they're going for in terms of appeal, but it needs to make sense. If they have the ability to create these, and if they have the ability to train everyone in their use, why doesn't everyone have them? It would surely make traversing the world that much easier. Now, obviously it's not quite so simple in most cases to pilot something like this, I would imagine, and that would probably be the reason they give, in addition to having a lack of resources. But I do hope they give more than just, oh yeah, there's only a few people that can pilot these javelins, and, you know, because reasons. I hope that is a solid reason that is given, otherwise it will feel a little bit strange that humanity is hiding in all of these fortified cities when they have the ability to create these weapons that should allow a bit more expansion out into the world. And speaking of that, how dire is humanity's situation really? Is it just business as usual, or are we on the edge of destruction? Like, has this been the state of humanity for quite a while? Or are we sort of constantly being pushed back, and sort of we're desperately now trying to look for ways and means to sort of reverse the tide? Now, this is something that I would imagine would be explained, at least in a very basic sense, very early on in the game, but it is still an important note. Obviously, Destiny had a very similar feeling as well, but the similarities to Destiny are something we'll go into in a bit more detail a bit later on. But I would like to know how dire the situation that humanity is in here, because it definitely gives the feeling that there are a fair few fortified cities from the promotional material. If so, where is the extreme peril? Or if there are only like a handful of fortified cities and sort of this is the last of humanity, surely there needs to be a little bit more panic going on. It feels as though I don't really know how dire humanity's situation is, and from the promotional material, and while this is something that I would imagine would be explained very early on, it is still an important point. And again, I hope they do put a little bit more effort into it than just saying, this is the situation, okay, moving on, let's get you into your superpower armor and start shooting things. Because obviously the backstory is going to be important to get people invested in this game. Speaking of investment, something that Bioware has always used to good effect to invest people in their games is of course the story and the characters, and once again, while this may not be the primary focus of Anthem, it is still a tool that Bioware can use to get people invested for the long haul. And while there is only a small amount of this that we can get from the pre-launch material and from any demo material that they may release, this has been what people have considered to be Bioware's biggest strength in the past. I'd argue that characters have been a far bigger strength of their games than the actual core narratives. But even with a lower priority, people will still expect effort in both of these two areas. So the setting is, you are of course a freelancer, as was obvious from the description of the world. You are one of the very few people that can go out and venture into the world and take the fight to the chaos that envelops it. And you live in a fortified city called Fort Tarsis, fortified to keep all of the nasty abominations of the world out. And those that built your particular city were a group called the Legion of Dawn, which you are descended from, who built the first javelins, and under the command of a general, who the city is named after, General Tarsis, fought back against the various hideous creatures of the world and the chaos. Another question that I would ask here is, are javelins widespread to other fortified cities? Because it's certainly heavily implied that there is at least one other fortified city based on the pre-launch material. So, you know, are javelins widespread to them as well? Were they distributed to all cities in an effort to fight back, and now sort of cooperation has collapsed a little bit? That would be another interesting point to explore. Fort Tarsis itself is going to be the hub where it is said that the single-player role-playing sections of the game take place, interacting with different characters and factions within your city. All adventures begin and end at the fort. Now, this is perhaps a little bit of a downside in my opinion, because it says this is where all of the single-player role-playing sections take place, certainly at launch at any rate. This means that during actual quests and missions it will take on a much more MMO-like feel, which again I feel as though this wasn't really to be too surprised at, because with the removal of stuff like the party, the chance for sort of storytelling on the fly in these quests is going to be limited to the actual story of the quests themselves rather than any characters involved, because obviously the characters involved are going to be you and other players, and you're not going to get much in the way of deep conversation from sort of a drunken play session with your friends on a Friday night, and nor are you going to get much from the way of not much in the way of deep conversation when you play with randoms either. So NPCs are largely going to be limited, it would seem, to this fort, and I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to really get a good story done just within the fort itself, but we'll see. But as a freelancer, your job is to venture into the world and fight back against the Dominion, which are a militaristic group in the north whose leader, who is called the Monitor, seeks to harness the Anthem with a view to subjugating the rest of humanity and to, quote, end the needless suffering. Now, this also concerns me a little bit because this feels very much like a good guys versus bad guys with very little nuance type story. That's the feeling I'm getting from it at this point anyway. Mainly because of the name and the way that they describe themselves. I mean, the Dominion is it comes with a lot of negative connotations. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe there will be a little bit more nuance to them. I mean, the need to end the needless suffering certainly sounds very cultish, but if it's not taken to extremes, it could be sort of a little bit more complex than that. And the Dominion is the only other faction that's mentioned by name, but I do find it interesting that they are going to be the primary antagonist. Now, I know that presumably most of the world is going to be made up of sort of mindless beasts, and you can't really have them be the main villains of the piece. But it seems very, very arbitrary to have this evil group of humans which are going to be your foes. It gives me very much the feeling from Mass Effect 3 where they had Cerberus right from the beginning be antagonists of the piece, just so that you had humanoid enemies to shoot at for a lot of the game, as opposed to just having to fight the Reapers. And I feel as though narratively that sacrificed a lot of the potential that Cerberus had in that game, even if they were always going to be slightly more questionable in terms of morality. I feel as though that did a bit of a disservice to what they could have been. Even if they were going to be villains all along, they could have been used in a better way than that, I feel. And the Dominion gives off a rather similar feel here, where they're there more for the gameplay side of things than the narrative side, and also the need to have some sort of antagonist with a voice rather than a roar. Still, so this isn't all bad, it does at least show that there are other human societies out there which maybe can add a little bit more nuance to the situation, maybe, a lot more diversity among the settlements, and it isn't just a good guys versus bad guys type deal. Only a few characters are actually mentioned by name, and one is Owen, your optimistic and ambitious sidekick, Faye, the reclusive and mysterious scholar/academic, and Huluk, the grumpy and begrudging mentor. Now, this is something else which I'm honestly slightly concerned about, because the fact that they need to list these characters and almost list their tropes is a little bit concerning, because you want your characters to have a little bit of depth to them. Now, admittedly, they may very well have, but just the fact that they've been given a section where their personalities are explained at you on the website is a little bit concerning. And the fact that, these three, it definitely gives off a very similar vibe to how Destiny works as well, with their sort of central characters. And again, it's not really the best formula to follow, because really, aside from Nathan Fillion in Destiny 2, the other characters have historically left a lot to be desired, being very, very white bread indeed. We'll see if we'll see if Anthem can improve on this in any way, but based on the fact that this section even exists at all, I'm a little bit concerned. But again, we can't really judge the characters until we actually see them and interact with them a little bit more, rather than just reading their overviews on a website. But I'm concerned from this perspective, certainly, because this has been BioWare's biggest strength in the past, and it is definitely receiving a lower priority in this game. Something that isn't receiving a lower priority, as I've said before, however, is the gameplay, and the gameplay is going to be centered around the 4 classes of Javelin. This is probably going to be the most important decision you make in Anthem, which one of these Javelin suits you're going to be using. There are 4. The Ranger, which is the versatile all-rounder. This is more or less going to be the base from which all the other classes sort of spring off from. The Ranger can do a little bit of everything. The Colossus, which is the heavy, seems to be focused, a lot slower, tankier, a lot more firepower. The Interceptor, which is basically the exact opposite, a lot more of a focus around speed and agility. And then finally the Storm, which would seem to be basically Anthem's answer to the Mage, where it has a lot of elemental abilities, a lot more of a caster type feeling to it. So, 4 classes, all of which seem to be suitably different from a mechanical perspective, and there are numerous lists online which sort of display all of their various abilities. I have to say, if I were to pick one, just from looking at them, I would pick the Colossus, just because it seems to be, a lot of firepower. It seems to be the most different in terms of how it looks as well. It seems to be the most set apart, and there is something quite satisfying looking about having a sort of shoulder-mounted mortar as well as a big heavy machine gun as well. So definitely seems to be more my speed, but all of them, to be fair, do look as though they have their place, and all of them look fairly nicely designed, which you would expect considering this is definitely going to be one of the biggest aspects of this game. Each javelin has 2 pieces of offensive gear, 1 piece of support gear, 6 components, and 2 weapons that can be switched in and out. So this is obviously going to be on your inventory screen. And you switch them out at Fort Tarsis. Each piece has a power level that adds to overall gear score. All of the usual MMO accompaniments apply, with 6 rarity levels ranging from common to legendary or grey to orange. Killing certain foes and completing objectives will give you gear and a crafting system with blueprints is in place, so anyone who's played an MMO in the past, this will be extremely familiar. Anyone who's even played Destiny, this will be very familiar to you, because it's basically the exact same system. It's very tried and tested, and there's a reason why everyone uses it, because it works well and everyone understands it. It's pretty much an industry standard at this point. And of course, grinding for gear is what constitutes a rather large part of a lot of late game, sort of post-game in many ways, play in MMOs. So again, this is an aspect which I feel as though will have been tested and tested to try and make it exactly right, because if this is not satisfying, you could end up with a late game grind that no one wants to engage in. Again, I keep mentioning comparisons to Destiny, but Destiny did struggle with this, and this is an area in which Anthem can improve on Bungie's efforts, so we shall see. Javelins can be personalised with different materials, paints, vinyls, and, in quotes, more. A javelin's paint job is made up of 2 parts, which is the paint and the material. The material changes the textures, which the 2 examples they give are, you can range from metallic to leathery and everything in between, while paints and vinyls will obviously be for sort of colour and pattern design. Javelins are divided into sections which you can individually paint, so these won't apply across the whole suit. And in addition to this, 5 character animations can also be added to your loadout, including an arrival, a victory pose, and 3 emotes. And again, as far as an MMO goes, this is relatively standard fare. Although this is relatively few animations. Most MMOs will just let you use a huge series in which you can just sort of have yours. But I would imagine that these are limited because emotes are, of course, cosmetic. And that means that they can be put into an in-game store. So a lot of focus here on the javelins, which is unsurprising considering they're everywhere in the marketing for this game, and it is also worth saying that each individual section of info on the javelins, so for example that section about personalising them with paints and vinyls, took up as much space on the page as the whole entry for the characters, so it certainly shows how much more of a focus the gameplay is than the characters, once again, just from that little tidbit there. So again, I feel as though people who are expecting a huge character focus will be setting themselves up for failure, because all the evidence, well, setting themselves up for disappointment, because I feel as though all the evidence certainly points to certainly a much heavier gameplay focus and a much more of a focus around gear and your javelins. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, many of these kinds of games fall into the trap, I feel, of having rather, well, overly bullet spongy enemies. This was especially off-putting in The Division, where you would expect something like 2 belts from an M60 heavy machine gun would rip their way through anyone standing in front of it, but in The Division that would barely tickle a high-level mook. Here at least, the creatures certainly look as though they should be able to take a bit of a beating at least, but the potential issue of overly girthy HP bars still exists. Now obviously with boss enemies this is a little bit different, and certainly when you give a boss a lot of HP you can turn the fight into a very thrilling affair, but I would certainly hope that basic mooks don't take several rocket barrages to bring down. And obviously there is the issue of sort of level scaling, which can also rear its ugly head in certain areas. But these games being too grindy has been an issue which has shown up several times in the past, and I feel as though Anthem should have learnt its lesson from the games that it's trying to follow at this point. The verticality has been brought into sharp focus, with them very, very keen to highlight the players jetpacking around the world, not only in the air but underwater as well, even if I believe it's actually been confirmed that underwater sections will be transit only at launch and underwater combat will not be present, although they may very well have changed that. I don't know how difficult it would actually be to add underwater sections, but underwater fighting is one of the things which I feel as though people would really want, because obviously sea monsters can be pretty scary in their own right. Anyone who's played Subnautica and ventured too far out to the edges of the map will testify that. So I feel as though this is certainly the sort of thing which, even if it isn't in the game at launch, it will be there pretty soon afterwards, because this is an area which I feel as though Anthem could certainly have a bit of uniqueness to it. However, while all this jetpacking around certainly looks impressive, and according to all of these sort of demo reviews that we've seen so far, it would appear to be one of the most satisfying parts of the game, I would ask if this is just a time sink or not, because if it is just a time sink, then the novelty will wear off pretty quickly if you're just trying to get to a place as quickly as possible. The flying will cease to be fun, and even if you have engagements along the way, if you're trying to get to somewhere as quickly as you possibly can, they will also become annoyances, so it is a bit of a delicate balancing act here. I would also hope that there is enough room to actually express yourself with this verticality, and that the level design isn't overly linear. I would imagine that when you get to an area, it would start to sort of turn into a little bit more tunnel-like as they funnel you towards a boss. But I would hope that in the quote-unquote overworld that you would be able to sort of move around with a little bit more freedom, rather than being trapped within a few canyons, for example. We'll see. I mean, it is the sort of thing that you would imagine there would be at least an element of linearity to it, but I would hope that there's enough room to actually express yourself with this verticality that they seem to be offering, rather than it just being a gimmick that you sort of enjoy for a little while, but then becomes a little bit more of a tedious endeavour as you sort of try and get as quickly as possible to your next destination. The amount of firepower at the player's disposal certainly seems impressive, especially from the Colossus and the Storm javelins with the elemental and just outright firepower damage that those two offer. And again, provided it's not compromised by overly grindy enemies, and there is a good variety to the gear available, including the damage types, which I believe there will be. They have released a plethora basically of the different types of gear and weapon types that each javelin can use, as well as the damage types that they can engage in. Then the shooter part of this shooter game should be solid, but we'll see. I mean, Bioware have sort of had a bit of a mixed history with their gameplay in the past at best, so this could be their opportunity to show that they are a studio which is now very good and very solid on the gameplay, or it could be an opportunity to show that they still aren't quite up to par with some of the companies and development studios that have been doing this for a long time, like Bungie. And I would also say that visually the game also looks very nice, and unlike many games that get hit by the dreaded downgrade, it has been expressly promised that the PC version will not get this treatment, which is nice if it turns out to be true, although barefaced brazen lies like this would probably not go over too well at all, so I would be inclined to say that this would be a truth, and that's good, because the game does look nice, and if it can look as pristine as possible on launch, people will certainly give that a mark in its favour. And of course most people will rate the visuals lower than stuff like the gameplay and the stories, but it is still an aspect of the game which, if it's overly ugly, as we saw with some of the destabilising aspects in Fallout 76, it can certainly affect the public perception of it very, very negatively. However, at this point in the video, I'm sure you will have noticed the fact that I have mentioned the similarities to other games several times, and in particular to Destiny. This is something that people have mentioned time and time again with regards to Anthem, is how similar Bioware's game seems to be to Bungie in numerous aspects, actually. And I believe the main reason for this, honestly, is the art style and the colour palette used, because they are really very, very similar to Destiny in this regard. There are obviously differences between them, but if you were to just glance at the games for like about 5 seconds each, just leafing through various art and concept art and sort of the colours used for both games, you would probably struggle to tell them apart if you had them all mixed together, which is not great, honestly, because Anthem is a game which needs to differentiate itself from the competition if it's going to gain a lasting audience, and the fact that it does seem to be so similar in regards to its style and colours to effectively what is its main rival is a little bit unfortunate. And as I said previously, anyone who has played Destiny for any length of time will have noticed in the Javelin section the similarities in the gear level system. Now, this is common in MMOs, but it does seem to be, again, extremely similar to Destiny. At the very least, Destiny had it to be a sort of light level, which admittedly was a very sort of cosmetic name only. But, you know, Anthem's power levels for their suit, it would seem to be almost exactly the same, which, regards to these games as service, even the Division had this with their gear sets and the amount of damage that their guns did. It seems to be a necessity in order to keep the players on board for that late game grind and to keep that revenue stream going. Even so, they could have done a little bit more, I feel like, to differentiate this system from, again, its main rival. And from a high level, even the backstories have got certain similarities. They're not exactly the same, of course, but they certainly have their similarities. Humanity on its last legs, trapped in a handful of fortified settlements, while a brave few heroes must venture out to fight against the dark/chaos. It's an oversimplification of both, perhaps, but the comparison is there, and this is the competition Anthem needs to prove itself better than, not just more of the same, which I feel as though is the primary worry for a lot of people looking at this game, the fact that it does look so similar to its nearest rival. It needs to be more than its nearest rival, not just, more of the same. And while Anthem may have taken a little bit of solace, or Bioware may have taken a little bit of solace in the fact that Destiny 2 had a pretty awful launch, to be fair, and the fact that the most recent live service game, Fallout 76, was hideously received by the public, the recent Bungie-Activision split means people who have invested time into Destiny and walked away from it as a result of Destiny 2 maybe not being up to par for their standards, they may now be willing to give the series another shot now that Bungie are going to be self-publishing. And I feel as though Anthem would rather have hoped that Destiny would have remained in the doldrums a little bit, so people would have come across to Anthem. Now, however, that's much more in question, and the fact that Bungie are now going to be self-publishing is interesting on Destiny's part. Now, I do believe that Destiny, all that was wrong with it was not just Activision. I do believe Bungie made missteps as well, but people will now be willing to give that game another shot. So, again, presumably some more Destiny 2 content on the way, and then presumably also a Destiny 3 to follow on from that to cap off the series. We'll see if Anthem can withstand a resurgent Destiny, because I'm not sure. Destiny already has at least partially an audience that it has garnered. I mean, it has gone through a bit of turmoil, but it is still an audience that they have, whereas Anthem is going to have to build up from nothing whilst working against what Bioware have been all about in the past. So, uphill battle from that regard, whilst being perhaps a little bit overly similar to the game it's trying to prove itself above. Then there is the matter of the recent VIP demo which actually came out after I had recorded most of this, so this is going to be a bit added in after the fact, to be honest. However, it perhaps wasn't the best first impression that Anthem could have given off, mainly because of the fact that EA's servers seem to shit the bed a little bit. As even with this, what you would imagine to be relatively lower amount of players trying to get on, the servers seem to fill up very, very quickly. There wasn't a queuing system in place like there usually is from an MMO either. Even vanilla World of Warcraft had a queuing system, I believe, actually. So even with basic features like that, it doesn't really speak too well. I mean, this isn't an area that Bioware has experience in, as I've said before, but this really is just proof of that, the fact that it has omitted features like that. And obviously EA servers have had a history of being a little bit spotty. I think Battlefield 4 is probably the best examples you can give of EA servers being perhaps not of the highest quality, but if EA can cut costs, they will. Although if they cut costs too much on Anthem servers, which are going to be thoroughly reliant on their reliability, then the game will suffer greatly as a result. Naturally, however, this is basically the first time the servers have been thrown open to quote-unquote the public. I mean, it is people who pre-ordered the game and certain influencers as well. But even so, this is the reason why betas exist, I suppose. But then again, people did say that Fallout 76 would be much more technically sound on release than it was after its beta, and nothing changed. And Anthem is on the eve of release as well. Now, if it is just server issues, then these are the sort of things which can be tweaked as time goes along. But hopefully it isn't an issue with the actual game itself, otherwise that might prove to be much more difficult to unpick. And if it is, then my sympathies are with the developers, because it's clear that they've invested an awful lot of time into this game, for good or ill, and that will just be yet more slave time hours that they will have to work to fix this issue. And also, the open beta is right around the corner, so we'll see what happens when even more of the public are let loose on this game, if the situation improves or if it stays the same or, God forbid, gets worse. More of an issue, however, than the connection issues, I feel like. There was an article written by PC Gamer which I wrote, and they complimented the flying in particular. However, the other stuff they had to say leads to a lot of concerns. The fact that everything else wasn't great, according to them. At least it wasn't interesting. I mean, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't necessarily good. So they weren't a huge fan of the cutscenes that were playing out. They found them dull, apparently. And really everything other than the flying and the actual moment-to-moment gameplay was not the best. And again, this would speak to the fact that, the focus is not on the story or the characters, But if they have omitted them to the extent where people are starting to not like that aspect of the game, then Bioware could be in a substantial amount of trouble, because obviously this is what they have built their reputation on, and if it's not up to par, people will take a dump on this game, regardless of how good the core focus of this game actually is, which is just a part and parcel of what comes with the Bioware name. Now, admittedly, I'm not really too sure of what to make of online articles on games nowadays anyway, because, again, you could construe that as the PC Gamer article being written by a person who was impatient to get to the gameplay and just wanted to skip over all the story-focused cutscenes, which is a possibility, but I feel as though PC Gamer have at least earned a little bit more leeway than other vendors, with, you know, the likes of Kotaku and the like, where they can barely even play a game and then they bemoan it for being too hard. But again, we'll see. It just doesn't inspire too much confidence is all. So, to wrap up, what do I think of Anthem? Do I think it'll be good? And will I be playing it? Well, I will be engaging in the open beta, I think. There's no reason for me not to engage in the open beta to at least see what's what, and ultimately I have been on the lookout for a new multiplayer game. And will this be it? Do I think that this game deserves my good faith, and do I think it will ultimately be good? No, I don't think it will be good. I don't think it will be bad. I don't think it will be a disaster like Fallout 76. I think it will be solidly in the middle. And that is not what Anthem needs to be in order to reach the expectations which has surely been set. And I feel as though everything which has been going on pre-release points to it not really being a masterwork, which, again, the potential is there, which is probably the saddest thing, because I feel as though if someone really took this format and really pushed all that it had to offer, rather than just focusing on the monetizable elements, just getting people engaged and coming back every day and just getting involved in the grind, it can be so much more than that, this genre, and no one has really done that yet, and I don't see any signs that Anthem will really be any different, which means at best it will be a 5, maybe a 6 out of 10 for me, but I think it could even be in danger of slipping down to a 4 if it sort of falls into the same pitfalls as several other games of this type, like it being overly grindy, there not really being too much interesting to do. The only thing that people really want to do in it, you know, customizing their suits and making themselves more powerful, get those bigger numbers at the end of your gear. If that is all there is to the game, it will be a dreadfully shallow experience, which it can't really afford to be. It needs to push itself ahead of the now plentiful competition. However, there is a rather sad side to that, and that is that I'm relatively biased with regards to this game, because ultimately I don't want it to be good. I don't want it to succeed. Now, neither do I want it to completely fail, because if it does, then, like I've said, EA are very gung-ho with sort of cutting studios which don't meet their expectations or that they have seen as past their usefulness. But I don't want it to succeed greatly either, because if it does, this will be the future of Bioware, this type of game, and they will never again really be allowed to create the type of games that they did in the past. Now, my faith in Bioware has not really been at its highest for quite some time now, but I have always held on to the small hope that maybe, just maybe, one day they could get back to making games similar to those that they did in their golden generation. However, if Anthem succeeds to a large extent, they will not be allowed to by EA, because this will be a big money maker for them, and this will be the future of them moving forward. However, I do also feel as though Anthem won't make as much money as EA would have wanted anyway. I don't think it'll be a commercial flop, but nor will it be the cash cow that EA wants it to be. Solidly in the middle, a solid, mediocre performance all around really is what I predict from this game. I don't doubt that it will have its moments of fun, but neither do I doubt it won't really be able to knock it out of the park. This performance, I imagine, would not result in the end of Bioware. However, it would also put a lot of pressure on their next title, which, The Dread Wolf Rises, is the tagline that's been given to the upcoming Dragon Age game, although I imagine the title will be somewhat different. Dragon Age, insert subtitle here. Dread Wolf Rises is a little bit of a mouthful, doesn't really roll off the tongue nicely. But it will put a lot of pressure on that game to succeed and to be good. It will be sort of the D-Day for Bioware. Games like that have produced fantastic results in the past, and The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind is probably the example that I will always give as a studio-saving title that was fantastic for its time, and I still love that game. And The Dreadwolf Rises may very well have to be that for Bioware as well. If Anthem doesn't meet expectations and it performs in a mediocre fashion, EA will maybe start to lose its patience with Bioware a little bit. I mean, Bioware are one of the bigger names that EA has under its wing, and the PR fallout that EA would get from killing Bioware would probably be pretty substantial. But EA has been very brazen about such things in the past, with the sudden destruction of Visceral coming as a bit of a surprise to most people, I think. But yeah, I mean, this is the situation that we find ourselves in now. Anthem could be fantastic, it could be terrible, but most likely I feel like it will be sort of slap bang in the middle. And then focus will shift, I think, to the next Dragon Age title, which hopefully will have a little bit more potential, a little bit more reasons to be cheerful on the lead up to it, but it may also have even more pressure on it than Anthem from an outside perspective, if that was even possible. We shall see, but I do wish Bioware all the best. Their employees have certainly worked hard on this game, and I know from slight personal experience that software development can be a pretty hideous time for all involved, and the ground level developers doing all the grunt work, their suffering, however, is not enough to make me reconsider my thoughts about this game. But I do hope that Bioware, you know, learns from an experience like this, whether it results in success or failure. They will need to sort of learn from what this process has taught them, I feel like, and hopefully moving forward into the future we'll see a little bit better performance from Bioware in the coming decade than in the decade that has just passed.